Messiah! I'm not the Messiah! I say you are, Lord, and I should know. I've followed a few. Hail, Messiah! I'm not the Messiah. Will you please listen? I am not the Messiah. Do you understand? Honestly!
Only the true Messiah denies his divinity.
What? Well, what sort of chance does that give me? All right, I am the Messiah. He is! He is the Messiah!
Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 27, and today we're going to be looking at the Messianic secret in Mark's Gospel. That little piece of the life of Brian, which I included at the beginning here, is one of my favourite pieces of the Monty Python film. And one of the reasons I like it so much is that it expresses something of what appears to be one of the bizarrest features in the Gospels. And it's this fact that there does seem to be some kind of attempt on Jesus' part to shut up the idea that he's the Messiah. At the very least, you seem to have a clear element of secrecy just running through Mark's Gospel. And to get a feeling for just how odd this is, it really contrasts with something like John's Gospel, because in John's Gospel, there he is proclaiming very boldly, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the bread of life, I am the way, the truth and life, and so on. He's just standing up there, big and bold, and proclaiming who he is. But in Mark's Gospel, when Peter works out who Jesus is at the end of chapter 8 and says, you are the Christ, Jesus tells him to be quiet straight away. Not go and proclaim this to everybody else, but tells him to be quiet. And it's not just there. You find this element of secrecy in all sorts of other places in the gospel. For example, whenever demons are being cast out of people by Jesus, he tells the person to be quiet. And when he does healings, he tells people not to let anybody know about the healing. And then when he tells people the parables in chapter 4, he seems to imply there that the reason for expressing himself in parables is so that people on the outside can't understand. It's only the disciples, the inner group, who are able to understand. One of the ways for getting a feel for just how odd this feature is, of secrecy in Mark's Gospel, is to look at Mark chapter 5, where you have the story of Jairus' daughter. Because here you've got a little girl who's died. There's a whole crowd in there. There are people who are mourning over her death. And then what happens is Jesus raises her from the dead, with the crowd having been turned away. And he says to the parents, don't tell anybody what's happened. And I always find myself thinking here, well, what happens the following Sabbath when she turns up at the synagogue? And people go, well, wasn't she dead? I mean, it seems a really strange thing to be happening. So what explains this strange feature of the Messianic secret, or of elements of secrecy in Mark's Gospel? Well, back in 1901, a scholar called William Vrede, W-R-E-D-E, Vrede, thought that he'd found the solution to this, and he wrote a memorable book called The Messianic Secret in Mark's Gospel. And his theory was a radical one. He thought that in his lifetime, Jesus was never acknowledged as the Messiah. No one said he was the Messiah. Jesus didn't give himself out to be the Messiah or anything like that. But then after his resurrection, people came to the view that he was the Messiah. That persuaded them that Jesus was the Messiah. So then when Mark, or at least those before him, who the tradition before him, when they're constructing the Jesus story, they have to find a way of marrying together these disparate elements, the non-messianic traditions which they thought were around, with the conviction that Jesus was the Messiah. And what Vrede thought happened was that the idea of a secret was the literary motif that enabled the marrying of this conviction of Jesus as the Messiah with all this non-messianic tradition, so that the Messianic secret is almost like a presupposition of the whole creation of the first gospel, because it's a way of giving out all of these traditions, these originally non-messianic traditions, with the conviction that Jesus is Messiah. So you say, well, actually, the reason that nobody knew during his lifetime is because Jesus kind of kept it secret. And the verse that Vrede put special focus on was Mark 9:9, where During the Transfiguration story, Jesus tells Peter, James and John not to tell anyone what's happened until after the resurrection, and Vrede thought that was the kind of clue to what was going on. Well, the thing about seminal books like Vrede's book is that quite often the diagnosis of the problem, quite often the description of the problem is more memorable and survives for a longer time than their actual solution to it. And that's very much been the case with Vrede. Lots of people are persuaded that there is a problem here, but few people these days will take Vrede's explanation at face value. One of the problems, for example, is that a lot of those traditions do look rather messianic. I mean, Jesus comes into Jerusalem riding on a foal, following that prophecy in Zechariah about the king coming into Jerusalem. And given that it seems that Jesus is acting in this messianic way in these kind of traditions, you do begin to wonder whether Vrede's idea of non-messianic traditions really is correct for the pre-Markan stage. But here's the thing. It's not like a historical Jesus explanation will provide us with everything that we need to explain this. I mean, yes, it is true that you could say, for example, that Jesus, the exorcist, wants to silence people because that's the kind of thing that exorcists do. And, you know, it might also be true that Jesus was deliberately trying to hide his identity so that he didn't get too swamped by people, that he didn't get too much trouble with a kind of fame getting out of control kind of thing. So you can have all of these little historical explanations, but the problem with them is, and this is where people often fail to come to terms with the strength of Vrede's case, the problem with all of those is that the Messianic secret is a key feature, redactionally, distinctively, of Mark's gospel. It's something that Mark seems to be stressing, and so just appealing to, well, this is what really happened, doesn't really solve the problem of why Mark wants to make such a big deal of it, because he didn't have to. He could have written the gospel differently, couldn't he? And it's a key redactional feature, not only because it's repeated lots of times, but because it happens at key structural moments in the gospel. So how do we make sense of this feature? Well, one way that I think I like to look at the problem is to remind ourselves just how unusual it is that Mark is coming out with this idea of Jesus as a Christ crucified, as a Messiah who's going to suffer. The thing is, for us, those terms Christ and crucified are kind of religious cliches, so we take it for granted that Jesus was crucified and therefore that there's something expected in that. But for Mark and for other early Christians, this isn't natural, it's not expected, it's bizarre, it's unusual. And in fact, Paul is grappling with this in 1 Corinthians 1 when he talks about the idea of Christ crucified as being a scandalon, a stumbling block for Jews. And Mark's kind of like that. I think what Mark is trying to do is say that you might think that this is a bizarre story, the idea of a Christ being crucified, but actually this is what really happened. And so he uses this motif, the Messianic secret, as a means of stressing it. Well, how does he do that? I think he does it in this quite interesting way. He has the confession of Jesus before the high priest right at the end of the gospel in chapter 14, just before Jesus goes to be crucified. In other words, when Jesus finally makes confession of being the Messiah, that's when he goes to the cross. So Mark links very closely Jesus' identity with Messiah with his being crucified, almost as if the news gets out that he's the Messiah, then he will suffer. So Mark is coupling very closely Jesus as Messiah and suffering. So what happens is the high priest says to him in 14, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus says, "I am, and you'll see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven," etc. And the thing about that is that then Jesus goes towards the cross. And you notice then at this moment where Jesus is crucified as the King of the Jews that all of those hints that you've had earlier in the gospel are now being fulfilled. What happens at the end of the gospel is that all of these strands that you've seen come together. And after all, the reader always knew that Jesus was the Christ. He's known it, or she's known it, right from the first verse of the gospel, which declares this as the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah. And it's not just the reader that's known it, but God's known it, because he's proclaimed it at the baptism, he's proclaimed it at the transfiguration, and the demons know it, the supernatural elements know it. They keep saying Jesus is the Son of God. So everybody knows it, and then finally, when it comes out into the open at the end, that's the thing that leads to Jesus' death. So you have a coupling of Jesus' identity as Messiah with his destiny to be crucified. So I suspect that what's going on in Mark with this whole business of the Messianic secret is he's actually using the motif as a means of foregrounding Christ crucified. His whole gospel is a gospel of Christ crucified. The first half of the gospel, up to Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, is all about establishing Jesus' identity as the Messiah. And the second half of the gospel is all about that journey to the cross, the way to the cross. And in that way, he's using his narrative to express something that was key from quite early on to Christians that were reflecting on Jesus' life, death and resurrection. Well, thanks very much for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com. You can Google for the NT Pod. You can find me on Duke's iTunes U. You can follow me on Twitter. My username is Goodacre. It's been good to have your company, and I'll be along again soon with another episode.